You have people from a whole lot of places.
നമ്മൾ ആദ്യം വിചാരിച്ചത് നമ്മുടെ കുട്ടികൾക്ക് മാത്രം എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചു. പിന്നെ നമ്മൾ വിചാരിച്ചു വേണ്ട, സാറിനെ പോലുള്ള ആളുകളൊന്നും സംസാരിക്കുകയാണല്ലോ, എല്ലാവരും കേൾക്കട്ടെ എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചു.
എന്ത് പറയുന്നുള്ളതാണ്. Because the basic problem is you don't get to see people. ആരെയും you don't get to see people. So prepare ചെയ്ത് എഴുതി വെച്ച് ഇന്ദിരാള് പറഞ്ഞു. Did he have that problem? Did he say that?
സംസാരിച്ചപ്പോ ഞാൻ എന്റെ ക്യാം ഓൺ ചെയ്ത് വെച്ചു, കാരണം ഒരാളെങ്കിലും കണ്ടോണ്ട് സംസാരിക്കാലോ എന്ന്.
That's why I was talking about that to Arvind. അല്ല, ബിക്കോസ് നമ്മളൊക്കെ ഈ പഴയ MGR MN നമ്പ്യാർ സിനിമ പോലെയാ, റിയാക്ഷൻ കിട്ടിയില്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒന്നും നടക്കില്ല. ബിക്കോസ് ഈ എഴുതി വെച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ശീലം ഇല്ല. എഴുതാനൊക്കെ ശ്രമിച്ചു, ബട്ട് then I realized at the end of it this is not going to work.
അത് വേണ്ട,
ഇല്ല, അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ആലോചിച്ചു. കാരണം ഇതാണല്ലോ ഒരു ഇൻഡക്ഷൻ എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞു വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് ഇറ്റ്സ് എ ഡിഫറെന്റ് കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് തിങ്. പിന്നെ വാട്ട് യു സ്റ്റാർട്ട് തിങ്കിങ് ഇസ് ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ആണ്, സാഹിത്യം പഠിക്കാൻ വരുന്ന കുട്ടികളാണെന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞ് അങ്ങനെ ആലോചിക്കുമ്പോൾ യു ഫീൽ അതിന്റെ ഒരു എന്തോ ഒരു സാധനം വേണം എന്നൊക്കെ ചിലപ്പോൾ തോന്നും.
ഇപ്പൊ സ്ഥിരം ഈ മോഡലല്ലേ ക്ലാസ്?
ഇത് തന്നെ ഓൺലൈൻ വാട്സാപ്പ് ഒക്കെ വെച്ചിട്ടാണ് ഞാൻ ക്ലാസ് എടുക്കാറുള്ളത്. ഞാൻ ഇത് ഗൂഗിൾ മീറ്റിൽ ഐ നെവർ ഡു ദാറ്റ്. ഐ യൂസ് വാട്സാപ്പ്. I think is a lot more friendly in the sense that you can keep chatting and if you want you can even record your voice and then share it across. Josie, hello. Josie ന്റെ
hello. Hi Josie.
Hello. ജോസിക്കും ഇൻഡക്ഷൻ ഉണ്ടല്ലേ?
എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു
കണ്ടോടാ ജോസി. ഹലോ.
ഇപ്പോഴാണ് ലിങ്ക് കണ്ടത്.
ശരി, ഹാപ്പി ടു സീ യു. അതെ, കാണാൻ. രണ്ടാമത്തത് ജോസിയുടെ രണ്ടാമത്തെ ഹൗ ഡിഡ് ദാറ്റ് ഗോ? രണ്ടാമത്തെ ലെക്ചർ ഞാൻ കേട്ടില്ല. ദ സെക്കൻഡ് വൺ.
Which one?
മറ്റേ സീരീസ്, തിയറി സീരീസ് ചെയ്തല്ലേ? നാലെണ്ണം ആയില്ലേ? ഞാൻ ആദ്യത്തെ ഞാൻ കേട്ടു. പിന്നൊന്ന് ഞാനത് കണ്ടു, ആ ലിങ്ക് പോയില്ല, ക്ലിക്ക് ചെയ്തില്ല. സംതിങ് അവിടെ കുറച്ച് പണികൾ വന്നു അതിന്റെ ഇടയ്ക്ക്, അപ്പൊ അത് മിസ്സായിപ്പോയി.
I'll send it to you.
അത് മിസ്സായിപ്പോയി. അല്ല, അതൊന്ന് കണ്ടു, അപ്പൊ അത് ചെയ്യണം എന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചു. തന്നെ മിസ്. അതൊന്ന് മിസ്സായിപ്പോയി. ഞാനൊരു ലിങ്ക്
ജോൺസൺ മാഷേ, നമസ്കാരം. ഞങ്ങളുടെ കുറെ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ഒന്ന് ജോയിൻ ചെയ്യാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്.
ഇതില് മറ്റേ നമ്പേഴ്സ് ഉണ്ടോ? നമ്പർ റെസ്ട്രിക്ഷൻ ഇല്ലല്ലോ അല്ലെ? അല്ല, 100 എങ്ങാണ്ടല്ലേ? അല്ല, ഇസ് ഇറ്റ് യു ഹാവ് മോർ ദാൻ ദാറ്റ്? യു ക്യാൻ ഡു മോർ ദാൻ ദാറ്റ്? എങ്ങനെയാണ്?
250 ആണ് സർ. 250
അത് ശരി. നേരത്തെ 100 ആയിരുന്നില്ല. അപ്പൊ ഡിഡ് ദേ ഇൻക്രീസ് ഇറ്റ് ഓർ അതൊരു ഓപ്ഷൻ ഉണ്ടോ?
There are two versions. ഫ്രീ വേർഷൻ ഉണ്ട്, പെയ്ഡ് വേർഷൻ ഉണ്ട്.
Okay.
This is the college's account. I think our limit is 250.
250 അല്ലേ? Okay.
Right. Zoom, I think even 500 people can join at a time.
Zoom, I think it's a lot more.
Yeah. If it's a paid version, of course. Yeah.
Right.
ഞങ്ങളൊക്കെ സൂമിലാണ് ക്ലാസ്
എടുക്കുന്നത്. എനിക്കത് പറ്റുന്നില്ല. ഐ വാസ് ടെല്ലിംഗ് ദം ഞാൻ വാട്സാപ്പാണ്. വാട്സാപ്പിൽ ടൈപ്പ് ചെയ്ത് വെക്കുമ്പോൾ ഐ ഫീൽ മേ ബി ദേ വിൽ ബി ഏബിൾ ടു യൂസ് ഇറ്റ്. ആ ചാറ്റ്സ് അങ്ങനെ തന്നെ കളയാതിരുന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ദേ ക്യാൻ യൂസ് ഇറ്റ്. മറ്റേതാകുമ്പോ എനിക്ക് അറിയില്ല, സൂമിലും ഇതിലും അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുമെന്ന് ഐ ആം നോട്ട് വെരി ഷുവർ. ഇതാകുമ്പോ കുറെ സൗകര്യ.
നമ്മുടെ ചാറ്റൊക്കെ പിള്ളേർ പിന്നെ എടുത്ത് നോക്കുന്നൊക്കെ.
അല്ലല്ല, ആ ചാറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്ക് ഒന്നുമില്ലെങ്കിലും യു മേക്ക് ദം റൈറ്റ് ഡൗൺ സംതിങ്. അത് എഴുതിപ്പിക്കാലോ. ഒന്നുമില്ലെങ്കിൽ റെസ്പോൺസ് എങ്കിലും കിട്ടും അവരുടെ. അപ്പൊ മറ്റേതാകുമ്പം അങ്ങനെ ഉണ്ടാവണം നിർബന്ധമില്ല. അതാണ്.
Okay, have all the best.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
അരവിന്ദൻ, നമുക്ക് തുടങ്ങിയാലോ?
Yes, sir. We can start, sir.
So, good evening to one and all. Once again, very hearty welcome to this platform to participate in the second session of our orientation program for the MA students. And today we have with us Professor B. Hariharan from Kerala University, a long-time friend of mine and of the department. And I invite my young colleague, Mr. Aravindan Nair, and the research student of Professor B. Hariharan, to introduce and welcome into the session. Aravindan.
Thank you, sir. Sir, quite a few people are just joining. Can I just admit them first?
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah.
Please.
I think most of the students have joined exactly at 7 o'clock. So I think quite a few are waiting in line to be admitted. I'll just admit them.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's it. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in the MA induction program. This is a series of lectures that the English department is organizing to welcome our new, as in Hari sir's word, the Corona special batch to our midst. It's my personal pleasure and privilege to introduce the speaker for the evening, Dr. B. Hariharan. He's the professor and head at the Institute of English, University of Kerala. He's also the director of the UGC Area Studies Center for Canadian Studies, University of Kerala. He is an enthusiast for all things which involve action. Right? He's a master of theater, of drama, of Kathakali, anything and everything which involves the human in motion, right? That is how I understand Hari sir's varied and multifarious interests. He's also, on a personal level, a wonderful human being and a person who guided me through the world of books. So I am hoping that through this lecture, he will be able to orient you in that direction as well. Just like a powerful magnet is able to draw mere iron filings towards itself and endow them with a kind of magnetism. That is the sort of influence that he has had on me by introducing me to a whole world of reading books, literary discussions, so on and so forth. So without much further ado, I welcome you all to this lecture. I hope you all shall enjoy it. And if possible, I also request all of you to interact face to face through whatever limited possibilities that are available to us and make this lecture a really fun one. Thank you. Over to you, Hari sir.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson and Arvind, for for giving me this opportunity to interact with your students who have joined Sacred Heart College, Devara for their MA program. I understand there are some 45 to 50 students who have joined your college, your department for this program. At the outset, I wish all of them the very best uh, for their um, for their academic career in your college. Thank you very much once again for having me over. Uh, without other formalities, let me straight away start off. Dr. Johnson had called me over the phone and shared this thought of having an induction program and asked me if I could join and then participate and talk to the students there. And I did not know what I should say, so I just said yes. And then he asked me on what I would be talking on. I was completely bowled. I was not very sure what I would tell him. And the first thing that came to my mind was reading. So I said maybe I could do something on reading. So he asked me what. So I just said the importance of reading for literature students. And so he gave me the topic and he put it very nicely, the importance of reading for a student of literature. So that is how this idea did evolve. And I know that this is an induction program, and there are different ways in which I'm sure the induction program would have been organized, certainly by the college, by the department. But then we are living through such times when this would not be possible. And so let me tentatively suggest that we are perhaps living in dangerous times. And dangerous times would not necessarily call for dangerous action, but then perhaps for a different kind of an action. Dangerous times, I'm reminded of a book which unfortunately I don't have with me. I was searching for it for the past 1 week, a book that I was gifted, I must say. I was given this book and I remember reading it avidly. It's a book by a person called Andy Miller. And the title of the book, I feel, is so very uncanny, so very relevant for our times. The Year of Reading Dangerously. So I would say that the students who are joining now would be in this year. Probably some of you we all have been going through this this year of the pandemic, the year of reading dangerously. I think we all are doing that. A lot depends on how we learn to understand what it means to read during these times. How do we read during these dangerous times? It calls for a certain kind of an isolation. Perhaps we all kind of shut out everything from our surroundings as we sit and read, because we'll be lost in that world. We'll be lost in the world in which we find ourselves when we read. But then today, has the world lost us, or have we lost the world? So there is this very, very interesting, very important question, I think, that we all would be asking ourselves. And as I ask this question to myself, there are a whole lot of things that come to my mind. I talk about some of them in the course of what I want to share with you. The first one is, of course, again, a book that I remember hearing about when I was an MA student. When we all, I'm sure you also would be doing that, we all studied Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I'm sure some of you would have heard this about this writer, about this poem. I'm talking about my student days when I was in the MA class, first year MA class, and my teacher, Professor John C. Matthew, came to the class and he read out the first few lines in the East Midland dialect in which Chaucer wrote the poem. It's not at all like the English that we talk today. Read out the poem, and then you had the modern English version of that by Neville Coggill. Read out that, and after the East Midland dialect version, talked about the poem. And at that time, I heard about this writer called Giovanni Boccaccio. And Boccaccio's book called the Decameron. And he told us that the Decameron was a very useful model for the Canterbury Tales. Now, what was so special about the Decameron? Decameron is a collection of a number of tales, stories, a whole lot of stories that are told, and there are listeners. And this is a book that directly addresses the listener, the reader, rather. So I heard about this book at that time. I had never seen this book. And I still remember writing the UGC NET exam. And I remember, I think there was a question on Boccaccio's Decameron or on Canterbury Tales. And I remember writing something like that. Well, that is a story for you. Because when we read stories, we also become storytellers. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm telling a story. So to get back to the story, this is what all storytellers do. They keep going back in loops. And so let me loop back to my student days. So I talked about the Canterbury Tales and the Decameron. And years later, when I was doing my PhD, part of the research I was doing this abroad, and I remember walking to this place, to this library near the shop, and there was this market, this place where there were people who were selling old books, and there were some second-hand bookstores. I remember going to one of them, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I was able to purchase a copy of Boccaccio's Decameron with illustrations. Right now, why is it that I'm talking about the Decameron? This is a book that opens with a reference to the plague in Florence, in Italy. There was a plague. A whole lot of people were infected. A whole lot of people died, suffered. There were a whole lot of people who fled the city. When I talk about people fleeing the city, I'm sure all of us would recall those very, very painful images of people who left places where they were working, who walked because there was a lockdown in our own country. There were people who walked. What kind of stories would they have taken back to their homes? To whom would they have told these stories? How is it that we learned to read those stories? I'm talking here about another kind of a reading. What did we read when we saw those visuals? When I saw those visuals, I told myself I must go back and look at Boccaccio. I did that, and I thought maybe I must read out the first couple of lines at least of the Decameron to all of you. So what I'll do now is to read at least 2 or 3 sentences from Boccaccio, and then I will take you back to my MA class. Well, that is, I think, the way in which we all learn how to read. Most gracious ladies, of course, gents, but this is how the book opens. Most gracious ladies, knowing that you're all by nature pitiful, I know that in your judgment, this work will seem to have a painful and sad origin. For it brings to mind the unhappy recollection of that last dreadful plague, so pernicious to all who saw or heard of it. But I would not have this frighten you from reading further. I think for me that's very interesting, very important, particularly today, particularly now at this moment. But I would not have this frighten you from reading further, as though you were to pass through nothing but sighs and tears in your reading. This dreary opening will be like climbing a steep mountainside to a most beautiful and delightful valley, which appears the most pleasant in proportion to the difficulty of the ascent. I want to draw your attention to two words: the address to the reader, to the act of reading, and that last word that I read, ascent. For some strange reason, I am captivated by that word ascent, ascending the mountain. Uh, the name of another writer comes to mind, Nikos Kazantzakis, and Kazantzakis' autobiography, Report to Greco, where he talks about the ascent as a reader and as a writer. It's a very arduous thing. To read is a very arduous thing. And then to process what you read is even more challenging. This is something that I learned, I must say, as a student. You might be wondering, what is this man trying to tell you? As a student, I did this, I did that. No, it's not that. I don't think I was a very good student, a student who sat in front bench listening to the teachers. No. For my BA, I know what kind of things I did and what kind of things I should have done, I did not do. But I think it changed when I started doing my MA. And there's a reason for which, for this, I would like to go back to the days. In those days, there was something called a pre-degree course. So what I'm going to say now is a homage that I would like to pay to the college and the library in that college where I studied for 7 years. I studied in St. Joseph's College, Devagiri in Calicut. And this had a fantastic library. So I remember the first time I went to this college library. You had this place, this vast area for students to sit and read all kinds of magazines and newspapers. And we all would sit there and read. And there was, the librarian was behind the counter, and there were all these open racks that were available. And you could look at that. You had a catalog. You could look at the catalog, and then you had a form in which you could write the books that you wanted. And as a lad of 15, 16 years old, you were allowed to take 2 books home. And they would issue the book once a week to you because you had a lot of students there. So you would go there, write down the books, the names of the books that you wanted. You would put it there, and then you have your library card. You would get those 2 books. You read it. You return it. But then, more important was the reference section, which was cordoned off for 15 and 16-year-old students, or even for graduate students, for BA students. This was the section where they had books for the MA students, and this was upstairs. And you could see all the MA students there walking. And this was in those days a college exclusively for men, no girls. For MA, there were girls. So as a teenager, I would look up and I would see students there walking, taking books, fondling books, sitting there reading, and you had somebody who was there helping them out. So I still remember those days when I would look up to this section up there and say, one day I will perhaps go there, have the fortune to go there and browse those books. No, it was a very magnetic kind of a thing that really happened. So you would see this, and there was my very senior, much respected scholar who retired from the college, Nagesh. I still recall, when I talk about the library, I still recall how Nagesh used to be there, looking at his books and the kind of scholarship that he had after that. So this, in fact, came true when I got admission there for my MA. You go to the class. We had about 20 students in the class, and we realized that as students, I realized that the MA program was a very different cup of tea. So we had our very, very respected, very senior professor Vijayaram, who would come to the class. He was teaching us metaphysical poetry. Started off with metaphysical poetry, and the first time he came and he said, John Donne, and done, undone. And then he talked about the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpet. So it didn't at that point sink in, but then these words really did have some kind of an impact. And I was totally at a loss to figure out what he was trying to tell us. I realized that this was some poetry. And Donne was familiar, but then the lines that he recited were not all that familiar. So I still remember going to this library, going up and talking to the librarian, not exactly the librarian, the person who was upstairs, Radichan, that was his name. I told him, John Donne, in Malayalam, I asked him, we had a class and talking about John Donne, is there a place where should I look for this? And Radichan said, okay, Professor Vijayaram, this is what he has said, okay, this rack, this shelf, this book, you start with this book. He knew what each teacher would be teaching. And you go there, lo behold, the entire of John Donne, the entire of metaphysical poetry was out there for me. And then I discovered something. I discovered that it was possible to listen to the lectures, to the classes, and then go to the library and then figure out the books that your teacher had read to come to the class. And that, I would say, was a remarkable passion exercise, because I would go to the class to listen to the teachers more to find out if those books that they had referred to are there in the library. And then, of course, incidentally, you would also pick up what they were telling you. So this, I think, was a very, very fascinating adventure for me. So I would listen to the lectures of all these teachers, and I would go up, Shakespeare, okay, so whose class? I would say this person's class, this Shakespeare, this text, he would say there. Coleridge, okay, here. And then there were books, there are umpteen books, and then you would go look up this, and then you would discover, okay, the teacher had quoted so and so, and then you discover the quotation. I said, it's a big discovery. You found what he was saying, and then you would discover also books perhaps the teacher may not have referred to in the class. And then you kind of tell yourself, look, I referred to something that teacher did not refer to in the class. So that was adventure. And there was another, I must say, another adventure that I love sharing with all my students. I would love to share that with you. This was in the second year of my MA, when we had a paper called American Literature. And in American literature, we had to study Emerson's Self-Reliance, an essay which I'm sure most of you probably will also be studying. So we had Professor Jayendran coming to the class, and he was completely lost in that essay, and we were also lost in that essay. It was an amazing lectures, I must say, that we had. And he was talking about philosophy, he was talking about Vedas, Upanishads, he was talking about a whole lot of things. And in the process, he referred to a book called Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Emerson, of course, cannot talk about Aldous Huxley because he was born much later. But then he referred to Aldous Huxley and perennial philosophy, and then he drew some comparisons. I mean, that struck me as a student. And I checked, as usual, I went to the library. I turned the college library upside down, and I couldn't see this book. So I checked the catalog. So then I checked the catalog. And then I asked Radichan, there is this book. He said, no, we don't have that book. So I didn't have the courage to ask my professor, where did you read this book? So I had, so I had membership in the district library in Calicut at that time, which was near Mananjara Maidan, old library, not the new one, the old library, which was, I must say, in a pretty dilapidated state. Cataloging was not proper, I must say, and you will have to start from one end of the library and cover the entire library to get whatever it is that you want. You never know what you will get. So I would go to this library. We had finished discussing this essay and we had gone to so many other things. But then I went on, and then for some reason, that particular day, I got this book which was not the size of a regular book. It was an oversized, very strange sized book with a hard blue bind, and it was the perennial philosophy. I was in cloud nine. I took this book, came home, read this book, and I found what professor had said. I found that there. I was simply elated. I shared this with my friend. We had studied together for 7 years. So I told Shajil, look, I found this book. He said, yes, where did you find it? I said, I found it there. I'll give it to you. Read this book. I shared this book with him. I mean, these were the pleasures of reading, and perhaps reading dangerously in a very different sense altogether. Uh, I think this is what happens. I think when we look for things. I can, of course, go on about the personal experiences. I'm not very sure if this is what is required of me, but then I'm sure all of us who are listening here, probably not talking, I'm sure will have many, many such stories to tell. Because I personally believe that a book, apart from the story that it tells you, also has another story of the book. The book has the story of the book to tell you. And if you don't get that story of the book that the book wants to tell you, you will never get the story of the book that the book wants to tell you, and the story that is there in the book that has been told by the author of the book. So there are, let us say, more than one story that the book will tell you. So it all depends on the kind of stories that you would want to listen to when you read a book, right? So how do you listen to the stories that books tell you? There is one very interesting book that I was absolutely fascinated reading. I'll just show it to you. It is titled "This is not the end of the book." It's a very interesting book. It came out some years back. This is not the end of the book. I don't know how many times I would have gone through this book. Definitely more than half a dozen times, and it has never ceased to amaze me. And I think it becomes all the more fascinating because this is a book that talks about uh, a number of books and the way in which people would have gone to great lengths to procure books, to read books, to hide books, right? To promise books that they will read these books sometime. Now, this is something that all of us do many times. It talks about books that we probably never have read, books that we thought we would read, we would want to read, or even touch sometimes. And then it talks about what we do with the books that we read, and then how we read the books that we read. I always again tell, I don't know how I came upon this idea, hit upon this idea. I always tell my students that when they come to the class, I tell them you must read the books and then come to the class. And then they would read. Students do that. They do read or they attempt to read the books. And sometimes students generally, most of us sometimes kind of get put off by the bulk of the book. If it's a big book, what is it that we do? We would read the first 2 pages and then perhaps the last page and then look at the page number and say, it's too big for me to read. So it's difficult. Or you try to read it, maybe the first 10 pages you read and then you say it's difficult. I read it once, twice, thrice, it's too difficult, I can't understand it. I'm sure all of us say this. So I say this even at this age. I sometimes say that this is too difficult to read. But there is something there, there's something else that happens there. There's a certain kind of a conditioning that happens when we read. You know what happens is when we read a book, we get conditioned. We are always conditioned by the things that we would have done in the past. So a book that we would have read, let's say yesterday, would have conditioned our reading, our thinking in a certain way. And then you approach a new text, a new book, and then you start reading it. What happens is that conditioning that you had earlier would make you go in a certain direction, and you would construct all those resistances, and then you would start resisting the book. And when you start resisting the book starts resisting you. And then we have this beautiful word in English, difficult. We will say that the book is difficult, right? So I have a formula for this. I always believe that when I read a book, I learn how to read that book. That's the only thing I learn when I read a book. There's nothing else that I learn. So when I read a book, I learn how to read that book. If I've learned how to read that book, then I can read that book. And when I read that book again, I learn to read that book a second time after having understood how to read the book. And the second time when I read it, it is based on my first understanding, by which time the second kind of reading would prompt me perhaps to read the book a third time, because I would have learned to read the book a second time. That's the only thing that we learn when we read a book. I don't think we will learn anything else about the book, about whatever it is that we are reading. Because there's a certain way in which we condition ourselves, we train ourselves, we think of what we are doing. So once we do this, the kind of problems that we have, the difficulties that we encounter when we read a text, now that is something we learn to overcome. See, that's when we would open ourselves to the text, to whatever it is that we are reading, and whatever it is that we are reading will open of itself to us. In a way, there is a beautiful synchronization, I must say, of this reading process. That is what happens, I think, when we read. Because there is this dialogue, there is this interaction or an exchange that happens. Because when we read, we think that a book is something that is inanimate. It is not, because it lives. A book would live when we read it. Because when we read, I think we breathe in whatever it is that we are reading. We take it in, and then we would read something else. We would take that also in. And there's a way in which we synthesize. I think this is what happens. It is not that we read a book and then say this is the meaning of the book. There's this whole remarkable, beautiful thing that happens. And it is from this that all the different kinds of responses that we give to whatever we read, that really comes up. It is not because we would have read a whole lot of theories. Josie is sitting there. I'm sure he would have something to say about this. The theories that we read, it's not that. So there's a way in which a whole lot of this happens in us when we read. It could be a story, it could be a concept, it could be an idea, it could be anything for that matter. So there's a way in which we respond to it. We learn to respond to it, and every time we read something, we learn how to respond to it. So my basic thumb rule when I read is when I read a book, I learn how to read that book. When I take up another book, I learn how to read that book, not the earlier book. It's not a, I don't think it's a big thing to say, but then I'm reminded in a way of how a whole lot of audience were flummoxed when they first saw a play like Waiting for Godot. Because they said this is not the Shavian kind of play or the plays of Galsworthy that they were familiar with. It was asking for a very different kind of an experience that they somehow had forgotten. And Martin Neslin, in his book Theatre of the Absurd, captures it beautifully. And that's where he would remind us, talk about, he would ask us to go back and look at someone like Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton or Laurel and Hardy, which would take us back to the interludes, right? And all those things Europe was doing in the 14th, 15th centuries, etc. So there was certainly a tradition. The slapstick tradition, we forgot that there is something called the circus when you watch plays, because it's the body in performance. And what is the act of reading? The act of reading is the body in performance. So we read a whole lot of things around us. That is the reason why I started off by talking about Boccaccio, and I talked about the pandemic and the refugees. So I'm talking about not just reading a particular book, I'm talking about reading all the signs around us, all the things that are available around us. Because for a student of literature today, the student, I would say, is not confined to the classroom, is not confined to what the teacher is saying, to the books that are prescribed, because there is this big, big world outside, a whole lot of things are happening. There are multiple forms of media, multiple forms of text, reading experiences that are available. So how is it that one becomes open, available to all these experiences? How does one read? Now, the biggest question that we have now is this: how does one read? How do we remember what we read? How is it that we stack some of these things in the software that we have? How do we learn, let's say, to even read things when we are on this online platform? Right? Because this is what all of you are going to do. You will probably use a Moodle or a Google platform or whatever kind of a platform that may be. So you don't have, let's say, the physicality of the book in front of you, but then you have the digitality, if one might use that phrase, coin that phrase, the digitality of the whole thing. And we are networked, we are perhaps connected. So it's going to be a very, very different kind of experience. We are, I must say, wired in unforeseen ways. There was a different kind of a wiring that happened, let us say, when we all had books in our hands and went to the classroom, sat and saw the teacher. That was a different kind of a connectivity. It was very perhaps tangible. It was much more, it was immediate, physical in a very different sense. But then we are rewired in a completely different way. Now, when we are rewired like this, what then we have to ask now as readers of literature, what happens to the book? What happens to the book? What happens to our physicality as readers? What happens to the physicality of the book? And what happens to that whole experience of reading? I mean, this is a question that I think all of us, I feel, would have asked in different ways, even before the pandemic set in. Let's say with the way in which we started using smartphones, with the way in which we started using the internet or all those platforms that we have, the Kindle editions and all the other the ebooks that we have. There is this world that we created. And we do that. We I would say, network in a very fascinating way with when we start reading the books in the layer of the brain, in the silence of reading. It's a profound world that we create, that we construct. And I think the biggest challenge that we have today, particularly in an English literature classroom, is to really recreate that whole dynamics, that life of reading something in a classroom or sharing something in a classroom, all the experiences that probably we have and we perhaps fail to have when we recite a poem out loud, and the feel that we have when we touch the chord of the text, whatever that text may be. Perhaps this is a time when we learn to read a book like the way in which we probably might watch a film. I'm not an expert in film studies, but then perhaps there is some kind of a resemblance there, because we are talking about moving images and sounds that we hear, and then we learn to discover a whole lot of things, and we learn therefore how to read a film. Well, if we can learn how to read a film and enjoy what the film is trying to tell you, I'm sure we would discover ways in which we can read books online, we can listen to lectures, use online materials, use a whole lot of things that are available online. And that, I'm sure, is going to be a very, very different experience. Now, what this does for me, I would like to go back to a couple of things that it's not the end of the book talks about. A couple of things here, and perhaps after that have some time for maybe discussion or even for sharing some experiences or whatever Johnson has in store for us. It's not the end of the book talks about the whole art of synthesis. I think this is what happens in a literature classroom. The art of learning in itself, I think that is a very, very important, very fascinating thing that we discover in a physical classroom, or even in a virtual classroom, or even when we go to a library. We now have not just the St. Joseph's College Devagiri Library where I studied, but then with the net, with the kind of access that we have, with the host of materials that we have, we literally live in the Tower of Babel. We live in the Tower of Babel. For some reason, of course, all of us, I'm sure, will be thinking of that beautiful Borges story, the Tower of Babel. And it takes you back to that perhaps master narrative of the Tower of Babel in the biblical text, which talks about how it was a curse. But then we know that it was not a curse, because of the Tower of Babel, we have all these languages. And there is so much that we can share, so much that we can listen to. So there is so much there to discover, to explore, and we can go in whichever way we want. And we would certainly come across some bookshelf waiting there, which will probably have that hidden copy of that book by Aldous Huxley, which I mentioned, Perennial Philosophy. I think we all would discover those perennial philosophies in that library of Babel that Borges would talk about. So that itself is another art of learning, which is something through which we go when we, I think, participate in an online classroom or in an online sharing of resources in the library. Because what happens, I think, here is this: you can learn more than anything else. You can learn how to learn. Well, if you can learn to read when you read a book, I'm sure you can learn how to learn. I think that is what happens today. And I think that also perhaps even transforms the way in which we internalize or respond to the different kinds of books and texts that are there around us. The sheer volume of that can be mind-boggling. We may not be able to get everything, but then whatever it is that we get, we make sure we get it. I don't know, for some reason, I am also reminded of this essay that I had studied, that I had read long back, some 30 years ago. It was in a very interesting, at that time I thought was a very dense book called Theories of Literature by René Welleck and Austin Warren. Theories of Literature, which I thought at that time, 30 years ago, I thought was a very difficult essay to read. But then I still carry something from what I have read at that time still in me. There was this essay in that book titled the mode of existence of a literary work of art. And it talks about how a work of art, a literary text, lives in you, inhabits you when you read it. I still feel that it gives you a lesson or two on the whole process of reading and getting things into your system. I think today, the biggest challenge that we have when we read is to handle the sheer volume of information that is there around us. Because with this comes this very big question of authenticating or of authenticity of what we are reading, of the information that we have. How authentic is the information that we have? So there is this question also, this larger question, should we look for authenticity in what we read? Is it all that important? What is it that we make of the information that we have around? This, I think, is a much bigger task for any student of literature today. It could be students who join for a new course, or it could be for teachers, for all of us. Because what it does then is filtering things. I think when we read, we should learn how to filter things. I'm not talking about censorship. When I talk about filtering, I'm not talking about censorship. How is it that we would know what we need to take and what we need not, what we need to avoid? Right? For some reason, again, another title comes to mind. Faith in Fakes Travels in Hyper Reality. Again by Umberto Eco. Faith in fakes. We have a number of stories like this. We have umpteen instances. We just need to go to our Google, and then there are these ways in which you are given prompts of the news channels that you watch, kind of news that you watch. So how do we sift from this? How do we sift materials? How do we go through this filtering process? What it also does is it also draws our attention to the way in which we create the kind of text that we read. Of course, you have a syllabus, we have a rigorous program, you have your internals, we have these semesters, and all these things are there. But apart from that, what does this filtering actually do? Because if you have to filter, there is this very fascinating way in which you learn to read some of these texts. The way in which you work your way through through all these texts that you read. We don't read the same Shakespeare that Shakespeare read when he wrote those plays. I'm sure that has changed. The Shakespeare that we read is far richer than the Shakespeare that Shakespeare's audience watched. How did that happen? Right? That is why I said when we read a text, we learn how to read that text. So the Shakespeare that I read, the Tempest, let us say, that I read when I was doing my BA was, I know, vastly different from the Tempest I read as an MA student, vastly different from the Tempest that I taught for BA English general class, vastly different from the way in which I read the Shakespeare, this text today. So what has happened is there's a whole lot of filtering that has happened. I think there is a dual process. There's a filtering in and there's a filtering out that happens. And I think when this filtering in and the filtering out happens, I think it's at that point, as readers, we create perhaps a masterpiece. I think we all create our masterpieces when we read. When we teach, for example, or when we read as students, I think we keep creating a whole lot of masterpieces. Think for example, something like this. How is it that we create or discover that a play like Hamlet is a masterpiece? Despite the argument that T.S. Eliot would make, Hamlet and his problems. Despite the problems that Eliot would find in Hamlet, Hamlet for me is a masterpiece. Right? I don't think there is anyone in the world who would have cracked the play. I don't think anyone would have cracked the play. Now, I'm not saying that Hamlet is a mystery. Now, I'm not saying that Hamlet is elusive. So there's a way in which it has become a masterpiece. Now, how did it become a masterpiece? When how would a play like King Lear become a masterpiece? How would even The Wasteland become, if it is a masterpiece? How did it become a masterpiece? I'm not talking about those literary texts. Think, for example, of a novel like The Great Indian Novel. Is that a masterpiece? How did it become a masterpiece? If we are talking about masterpieces, I'm talking here about ways in which Shashi Tharoor probably would have read the Mahabharata. It's not that he would have read it, keep thinking that it's a masterpiece. But it would be very curious to discover how he had read that play. I mean, I think that whole act of reading is a very, very fascinating process. I was, for example, very fascinated by a play like I don't know why I keep going back to this writer, a play like Merchant of Venice. I was very fascinated by the way in which you have a whole lot of open spaces and gardens in the Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare's plays invariably have a lot of scenes inside the palace and palace intrigues and all kinds of things, romances, etc. But then, for some strange reason, I was particularly fascinated by this text, and it never struck me when I studied this play when I was doing my BA or my MA or even after that. I was struck by it sometime when when I happened to read it for a seminar. I told them that I'll make a presentation, and that is when it struck me that there are hardly 3 or 4 scenes which are set inside a building, and all the other scenes in this play are placed outside. It could be either the garden, or moonlit night, or the Rialto, or whatever crossroad. Invariably, look at the stage directions. Invariably, a street in Venice. And this guy had never a street in Venice, and the Rialto. He had never visited Venice. This was a Jewish enclave, and that discovery was, I was absolutely stunned by that. It took maybe 30 plus years for me as a reader for that. It took me such a long time to discover something about the Rialto and the kind of transactions that happened. And to realize that there were those bridges and the way in which business was done there, and the way in which the entire thing was transposed, as it were, onto the English stage. And I was truly amazed by the fact that all these theaters were on the other side of the river, and then it was linked by London Bridge, the London Bridge of those days. And there were people who were walking in and out of these playhouses, and I realized that these playhouses were in some ways extensions of those streets that Shakespeare describes. So this was the performance, this was the theater that you have in Shakespeare. No, this was the way in which I realized the way in which this man created those plays and those masterpieces. I'm not saying that the people there were aware of this. As a reader of Shakespeare, of these plays, I discover this layer today, not when I was a student. So it took 30 years or more to discover something like this, and I felt happy when I thought, hey, there is something that I found there. I found something very interesting apart from the set speech of Shylock or of Portia. I found there was something far more interesting about the way in which this playwright, this guy uses a whole lot of space. That dynamics for me was, gives you another opening to read what he was doing. So, see, it is here that I discover, or I feel that, okay, here is this masterpiece. Because what this play is capable of doing, or what these texts are capable of doing, is to accommodate, take within all these interpretations. So the more interpretations it is able to take in, it would survive, and it is enriched. So I think I get about, 1 hour. So I still have about 5 minutes. What I'll do is, I don't want to take the full 1 hour. So the onus, I would say, is on all of us to not to create masterpieces, but then to discover something of the text that I think that all of us can carry with us, even after we do a text in the class or maybe a semester. So what I'm ultimately saying is this: as a student of literature, I think it's important to go beyond the worry and the botherations that we generally have as students of something called an examination. We get worried about end semester exam and mid semester exams. This is a concern a whole lot of students have. But then once you relish this experience, I think those become incidental, because there are far more fascinating things that you can do with the materials that you have around you. An examination is only a piddling thing. So just take it at that and then enjoy your course. Enjoy your reading. That is why I think you join for a course. Right? So I wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So that was absolutely fascinating what you told us about books and the world of reading. What struck me most was especially what you said about the library and the whole experience of going there. It is now that, when we are forcefully isolated and staying in the confines of our own house, that we miss that world of books, going into a library, and then just the random chance of
Right.
finding a book that you have been looking for, or something that you have encountered as what somebody has mentioned in class,
Right.
and seeing that on the book rack there. I think that is something absolutely irreplaceable. No amount of Google Meets or Kindles can replace that. Especially in this this generation that we belong to, the young teachers like us, we don't have that kind of a library in our own houses. The kind of library that I see behind Johnson sir there.
Yeah.
And so I have seen your library, which is absolutely something which is enviable. And that love of books, which should have been a part of all of us. I think it is something. It's a rare breed that we find people who have that store of books with them, who are willing to lend books like you. You are an avid lender of books who often lends books and it never finds their way back to you. So absolutely fascinating, sir. Thank you for enthralling us with your stories of books and about the importance of reading. I'm sure the audience has lots of comments and questions for you. So I invite them.
Please.
I invite them to respond.
Please. Yeah.
So we have a question from Malavika.
Yeah.
She says,
I'll read that.
I think it's,
do you
sure,
think
sir.
that we should cultivate the skill of unlearning because what we have read in the past as truth might be proved wrong now? That is a word I love. I use that a lot. Unlearning. I've always believed that the only thing that we do is unlearn. We never learn anything. We unlearn everything that we learn. I also tell my students that what happens in a class is a process of unlearning, and I would prefer to unlearn with my students all the time. Now, this is what happens when we read. It's not even a skill of unlearning. I think it's part of a learning process, because it's not that you learn to read something, but then you also unlearn a whole lot of things. That is also another kind of a kind of a learning, a kind of a learning process. It's not. I'm not very sure if it's a skill, but then perhaps we learn to build on what we have learned, and then we learn, okay, that's not the way to do things. I'm reminded in this context of something that my teacher, when I was doing my MPhil, when I was doing my research methodology class, Professor Ayyappa Panikar told us, he had, again, let me take us all back to the library. He was teaching us research methodology, and in one class he had asked us to prepare some kind of compile a bibliography, working bibliography or something like that. And he said, you have to go to the university library and do it. So when Professor Ayyappa Panikar tells you to do something, you better do it. So we went there, and I remember poring over the whole thing, went around, and then I got really scared because I could not get what he had asked me to get. I looked, I searched, and I became frantic. Despite the fact that I was able to stumble upon the perennial philosophy, I became very frantic. And it never struck me. I came back, and then I told him, "Sir, I searched, and I didn't find the book." It's something that students generally would say. I searched, and the book is not there. It's very easy to say that. So I didn't know how to tell this to him. So he smiled and he said, he didn't say anything. He just said something. He said, "That is information. That is information." And then he added, "There's a Chinese proverb. The window is important for what it does not contain." That, I would say, was an amazing learning process, an amazing unlearning process about how to approach something. Forget even a library, but then how to approach something. The window is important for what it does not contain. So I think this is what I would probably share with you about unlearning. And there is nothing called right and wrong. There's nothing called right and wrong. Because, like I said, we are building up on a whole lot of things. And we learn to build up on things. And then if there is a problem in one kind of reading, what is it that we try to do? We amend it. And if we cannot amend it, we would amend it. Even Shakespeare's texts were amended, right? They were even Bowdlerized. We all know that. So, that is, I think, the way in which we work with the whole process of, or that's the whole learning process or the unlearning process that we have. So I think that is one question that I have that came. So I'm sure there'll be more questions as the comments have come.
Sandra Joy wants to know your views on post-truth literature.
Post-truth literature. I would put it, apart from post-truth literature, I would say that truth was always posted. Truth was, I would say, posted and posited. So I don't think from there, it didn't have to, I don't think it even had to wait for a long time to reach a time where we would talk about a post-truth period. Because truth was always posted. I mean, think of that remarkable question of Pilate. What is truth? But then he did not wait for an answer. That is what Bacon tells us. We never know whether Pilate actually asked this question. But then again, we would ask English language literature students would ask whether it is T with a capital T or a small t, right? Truth can as well go for a cup of tea. Well, that would be post-truth, right? And we have had a whole lot of things that have come out on post-truth. So whatever has come out on post-truth, that would have come post-truth. That wouldn't have come. I don't know whether you can talk about truthful days or days of truth, because we have to ask: did we ever have days of truth? Did we ever have something like that? Right? We are, look at that. We are talking about how there is this loss of certainties. Right? We don't have any certainties. Now, when did this whole scenario come about? How did this come about? Where we cannot be sure of anything. Well, it is not something that happened in the 21st century. I would say that it happened much before that. Now, I'm not saying that all this happened during, it's all mentioned there in the Upanishad, etc. But then there is this uncertainty about a whole lot of things. And I think the best way to really talk about uncertainty is this: the way in which one would talk about one's own shadow. How does one read the shadow that we cast? Would it be a moment of truth, or would it be a post-truth moment, when there is a shadow and when the shadow disappears? Because when we walk, there would be times when the shadow would disappear. Would that be a post-truth moment? Or would it be post-truth when we see the shadow? Think of, I would say that there's a beautiful post-truth moment in a play like Oedipus Rex. If we recall, you have Oedipus bent on getting to know, arrive at the truth, and then he is warned not to look too deep, not to too deep, and not to inquire any further. He is warned. He doesn't listen, and then he is told that he has married his own mother. Right? I'm not going into the incest part, but then he is told something. He has been given this information that he was told he should not seek. And look, that I would say is that remarkable moment. That is a blinding moment in that play. And what you have then, it's a remarkable metonymic moment in that play. And that is what you see actualized in physical terms with Oedipus blinding himself. That I would say is a remarkable post-truth moment. Well, this is, I would say I also did experience this when we were students. We staged in the college. We staged Oedipus in Malayalam for the public. I also remember participating in it, and Oedipus in that play was a fantastic, a towering presence. Professor Job Katu from the Malayalam department, 6'3", and he was every bit Oedipus. So I think I witnessed that post-truth moment way back in 1988, but then I never knew that it would have a name like this. Oh, there is something on self-reflexivity in literature. My God, self-reflexivity in literature. How does one talk about self-reflexivity in literature? I think that self-reflexivity in literature is as old as literature. I don't think I'll be far off the mark if I say that it's been there as old as literature. I mean, we just need to look at all the oral narratives that we have. They're all, I would say, self-reflexive, where I think the person who's telling the story is very conscious of the fact that he or she is telling the story. We have, I would say, that tradition when we listen to stories that our parents or our uncles, aunts, grandparents tell us. Those are all, I think, we get those self-reflective moments when we ask questions of the storyteller. Is that so? For example, you have in book 2 of Don Quixote, where he directly would address the reader. That's a remarkable moment of self-reflexivity. You would have that in Rabelais, you would have that going back in almost all these narratives. It is. I don't think it's a very recent phenomenon, but then I think it became something that we celebrated because I think it came up at a certain point in time in critical discourse. This is what I personally. This is my take. Yeah. Does canonization and already written concepts and aspects about all great works hinder us from having that true independent exploration of a work? I'm not very sure, or is it like all these have an important role in experiencing the true essence of a work? I'm not saying problematic things, but then there are certain words I think we would be kind of scared perhaps of using. Perhaps one is canonization, and the word true independent exploration. Now, how do we independently explore a work? I would see. Let me put it like this: when somebody sits down to write, I would say that whatever is being written would have got the first reader and the person who is writing, right? And that would never be an independent exploration of a work, because when you start composing a work, it would never be an independent exploration. So you already have an exploration happening, which becomes the work, which gets printed, published, and then you get it at a certain point in time, right? After it would have gone through an n number of explorations, where you would probably have people assuming, thinking that they are doing or making an independent exploration. Right? All that probably knowingly, unknowingly would have added to the different layers of the text by the time it comes to you. So what is it that you are reading? And what is it then that you will explore? Right? That is one question that I would have when I read. Now, I'm not therefore saying that I will not be able to enjoy whatever it is that I'm reading. Right? I think it would be quite possible to even enjoy a book that you never like. Even that is quite possible, because it all depends on how you understand the word enjoy. It's not that every book must of necessity give you goosebumps, right, or bring tears of joy in your eyes. Some books can be can bring in a whole lot of agony, and some books can be equally agonizing, right? So I'm not very sure about this independent exploration, because like what I said earlier, there's a way in which whatever you read would learn to exist in you, because if it doesn't exist in you, then as far as you are concerned, there is no such work. Because if I am able to carry a work with me, then that work is alive. If after I read it, if it is not in me, it is not alive. So it can even be a book or something that I perhaps did not enjoy reading it. So there would be a way in which it would have found a place in me. If a book, if something, whatever I read, if it finds a place in me, there's a way in which I would probably continue exploring it, right? And that will never be independent of me, and I will never be doing it independently. Or is it like all these have an important role in experiencing the true essence of a work? Now, that true essence, perhaps because of maybe reading too much of, I don't know, theory, or trying to talk about some of these things, one will see red. I don't know, even when somebody writes a poem, whether this person would have discovered the true essence. Now, to my mind comes a poem like My Last Duchess. Now, do you think the Duke in that poem discovers the true essence of the painting as he describes his Duchess to the envoy? Well, does he get it? We don't know. So what would be the true essence of a poem, of this poem, of My Last Duchess? Does it have a true essence? What is the speaker there trying to communicate? Right? So what is it tries to communicate to you, or what is it that you try to perhaps see there? Do you see the portrait? Do you see the Duchess? Do you see the Duke? The Duke wouldn't want others to see the Duchess. That is the irony there. And then, apart from the envoy, you, the reader, get to see the Duchess with the envoy, and in the process, you see the Duke. There's a remarkable thing that happens there. So there is much more than discovering or experiencing the true essence of a work. I think it's that whole process of seeing what the text, what that poem, let us say, is doing with you and with itself in the process of doing whatever it is doing with you. So I hope I try to, perhaps if not answer the question, make it all the more convoluted, I don't know.
Thank you, sir. I think we have covered all of our questions. Johnson, sir?
Yes, Arvind. Harihan, sir, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. In fact, you have taken me back to my MA and MPhil times. I remember the insistence with which I wanted to read all the books in the MPhil library at Marathon College.
Right.
And the key of the library was with me, and Professor.
I know. Yes.
Trusted me and gave me the key.
Yes, that was a good collection that they had there.
Yeah, I used to sit up there until 2 o'clock. Sometimes I used to sleep in the library without his knowing, and I would get early in the morning.
And I think a whole lot of people who did their MPhil there, I think, have similar experiences. I think
that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. But maybe during the time, mostly my reading was on theory rather than creative writings.
Right.
Yeah, right. And then of course when I joined SH, we had our department library, which now we don't have it. It's merged with the library.
Yeah.
And so we had about 10,000 books, and I remember moving from one side of the shelf, from one corner to the other, every day sitting and seeing, all the books.
So that's an amazing journey when you go hunting, searching for books.
Yeah, that's true.
That too, when the whole thing is in a disarray, you discover things that you never knew existed.
That's true. And what Arvind said is right. In one sense, I don't know whether maybe because of the advancement in technology and and other developments.
Yeah.
The younger generation depends mostly on the gadgets rather than on the library.
Right.
That's part of a different culture, and we can't find any fault with that. It has its own advantages.
Yes.
And maybe we oldies, relish the other experience and still continue to do that.
The book, I would say, that is what Eco would say. The book is a perfected invention. You cannot improve upon it. And so I think it will be there forever. So
true.
as long as there are people to read, are there will be books.
Yeah.
Right? This is what I also kind of feel. Whatever technology we have, think of that. Even that what is it? Not that pager. That Kindle that you have. You get that feel of turning the pages. That is what you are told. I've never used a Kindle, but I'm told you get that feel. That even the color of the pages, etc. You get that feel. I'm told, but I've never done that. But then the whole process of reading, I think that is the most important thing. From the pages of the book to to whatever you see on the screen. The only thing is that there is this movement of the eyes like this. But then I think we are going back perhaps to the times before before the page, before paper was invented. Because in those days you had the scroll, because you had the
Yeah.
scroll. So you had the scroll, and then you started rolling it down, and then this is how you were reading it, right? And now look what happens. You are reading this, but in the book you are doing this, right? You are perhaps going back to the times before the book was invented, but then you are doing the same kind of an exercise. But the nature of the medium, I would say, has changed.
That's
Because one thing, it's virtual, and then I would say the virtual, because it is virtual, it is as ephemeral as the human being. So even the books that we have with us on our pen drive or whatever, they are, you say that the books are there, but then books are not there because you don't get to see them, because if your external drive conks, then you will never get it. So you are told to keep a backup. How many backups can you keep? Right. So I would say that it is as ephemeral as a human being, but then books, perhaps, yes, they probably have a slightly different kind of a lifespan, maybe 100 years, 150 years. Rare books, first copy of, let us say, Indulega, first edition, there is one copy of that available to the whole world, I am told, the British Museum, 100 and whatever years. But then you don't get to open it because it needs to be preserved, like the Egyptian mummies, right? Because I would say that's because it's a human invention. And so, like humans, they also do perish. But the readings that we do, they don't perish, but perhaps they become, in a way, part of that exploration that somebody was talking about. There's a way in which I think we learn to add to it. And that perhaps is the meaning of this word discourse. So I'm not using any theory there. I think this is the way I understand the word discourse. It is not Foucauldian, right? So don't ask me what Foucault said, I don't know. Right? Oh, there is something here about some reading techniques which could generally be used. One last question.
Yeah.
Reading technique, there's a shortcut for that. Maybe I can share that shortcut. Reading technique is to sit and read. That's the best shortcut. That's the only shortcut that we have, and that's the only technique that we have to read. I don't want to talk about skimming, scanning, etc. You get a book means you just read it cover to cover. You learn how to read it. That's the best way to read. That is the only technique that I think I've discovered as a reader of books. Learn how to read. That's the only technique that you will discover how to read it as you read it.
Yeah, that's something our students, especially, they have to discover it on their own. There is no shortcut there.
Yes.
There's no going to just Wikipedia or Spark Notes and going through the summary of a work is not the same thing. It is never going to give you that feel of taking your time, expending 5 or 6 hours in a novel, in a play, getting to know the characters as if they are your brothers and sisters, right? So that cannot be substituted.
Arvind, there is one way yet. In spite of there's one other way of doing it. Generally, students have this problem. Reading it is another way of is a technique, etc. There's one way. You can actually request the person who has written the novel to give you secondary materials. How to read this book, or what is the way in which I must read it, and then so maybe hereafter you will have novels with another glossary or appendix telling you how to read it. That has happened, that has happened with all those people who came with John Barth and Sorrentino and all these other people who came with instructions on how to link, have all those hyperlinks, etc. Right? There have been experiments like that, yes. Or I would say the guy who started all this happens to be that that poet who wrote The Wasteland. So I think we end up teaching more the notes rather than the poem. I think what you must do is throw out all the references and then read the poem and then ask them to do it. It's not that blind kind of thing that F.R. Lee or I.R. Richards was doing, but then get the feel of it more than anything else. Get the feel of, how would it sound when you read April is the cruelest month, reading whatever memories or etc. etc. What is the feel that it was? Because I think we need to learn primarily to read that poem before you look for what the meaning of Teriyu or those are pearls, etc. etc. Apart from that, read it and get the feel of it, and then perhaps look at it, and that could perhaps enhance the way in which you understand any text for that matter. You would miss out a whole lot of things, but it doesn't matter. I think we need to learn. I think we need to learn to sip things. When we were, one last example. I know sessions are over. When we were students, we had this paper Shakespeare. We had to study a lot of Shakespeare, and one text was that we had to do all the 154 sonnets of Shakespeare. So we had to study all that, and we had a Father Sebastian Punoli, who was teaching this. He had those clusters, and then he would read some of those poems, and then he would say, "You go and read the poems." So I remember buying a Signet Classic, just the poems, nothing else, 40 rupees, and then I would have it in my bag, and then every now and then 14 lines, one poem, just only 14 lines. You read those 14 lines. At random, you read them, you start dipping into it. You don't have to bother about what Shakespeare's friend, who the friend is, or who the lady is, etc. You don't worry about it. Read them, see if you are able to enjoy what he's saying, and then you may not get it. You may not enjoy the first time, second time, it probably wouldn't make any sense to you. You keep looking at it, dipping at it now and then you start discovering things. It's like we take a break when we are reading. We go to the kitchen, take something, drink some water, come back. During that time, read 14 lines. You do that. I think that's the best way to read, to enjoy poetry. Take it in bits and pieces, nuggets, small chunks. You take them, you will feel it. You'll get these things into your system. It's a fascinating thing to do. You will discover poems that, let's say, are not discussed in the class. I think that's a fun of doing literature, because you have all these things available, and now a whole lot of texts are available online. So when you go to Netflix, once in a while you look at Poetry Foundation or whatever, read something, right? And then get back to your Netflix and then do your assignments, etc. It need not be necessarily what you have to study, but then you get that you fill in a whole lot of things, right? I think that's the fun of doing an MA program. I think that's the fun of I think we all do it. That's the fun of doing things with students in the classroom.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Aravind?
John, sir.
Yeah, we shall wind up, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
So it has been absolutely wonderful hearing you talk about one of the subjects that you are passionate about. Absolutely. I mean, like, there is that it reflects so much in the words. So you said that you did not prepare for this, but there could have been no preparation which could have used anything better, right? I mean, like, this is absolutely the best, right? Classic. So I'm sure our students would find this absolutely fascinating. They would I think this will propel them in that direction, right? It is like igniting a rocket engine, right? There's absolutely overcomes that gravity that holds them back from the world of books and launches them into that universe. That is what I think. So from the bottom of my heart, on behalf of the department, on behalf of all of us, students and teachers alike, I extend our gratitude and thank you, sir, once again for talking to us and taking us through this journey. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and all the best to everyone.
I also find besides the students and faculty from SH, there are other faculty members from other institutions, and I saw Josie sir and Preeti and many others, and I also find many others even from North India. So I think we had actually hit the limit as Arvind messed up.
There were a lot of people trying to join, but
right.
Maybe we will change.
We have recorded this and we will provide them.
Okay. That's
and I thank all the participants and other faculty members who joined this session, and I particularly thank Hariharan sir. As I said, this is a long time friendship, so I know that I don't have to formally thank you. So friends, we will be here tomorrow exactly at 7 p.m. With we will have Professor Jairam with us tomorrow. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
അച്ഛാ നമസ്കാരം. നമ്മള് മാത്രമുള്ള
കുറച്ച് പേരുകൂടെ ഉണ്ട്. I think a few more people.
Yeah.
I think today around 145, 146.
അല്ലല്ല 150 ക്രോസ് ചെയ്തു. 150.